Sometimes a concept is a little ahead of its time, and it takes the American public just a little while to catch on to it. Other times, a concept is so far ahead of its time that everybody wants absolutely nothing to do with that. And there is no better example of that than the Chrysler Airflow and its corporate cousin, this car right here, the 1934 DeSoto Airflow. Hi there, Rick DeBrule here at the Martin Auto Museum with yet another collector car profile. You know, the Martin Auto Museum has an amazing collection of more than 170 cars that span the full automotive spectrum. Cars you know about and cars you may never have heard about, like this one right here, the Airflow. So what was so revolutionary about this car? Well, to be honest with you, where do I begin? Just about everything under and on top of this car was new and unique back in 1934. Let's start with the sleek body style, right? I mean, this was designed to be aerodynamic back in a time when nobody was doing that. It just looked completely different than everything else did back in 1934. You got to remember that the Deuce Coupe was just 2 years earlier than this. It looks absolutely nothing like this DeSoto Airflow. But it wasn't just that. There were so many other innovations in this car. It had unibody construction. I'll talk more about that in a moment. They were concerned about weight distribution, trying to give an equal weight distribution. They were concerned about miles per gallon back when, well, people didn't just pay a lot of attention to that. And there were no MPG ratings on cars. And this car, once again, was so far ahead of its time that it just wasn't successful at all. It just didn't do enough to make sure that this particular brand could move forward. In fact, the Chrysler Airflow, they were lucky. They had a second car in the Chrysler lineup that people were more interested. DeSoto, their problem was this was the only DeSoto you could buy in 1934. And while there was some initial interest in it, boy, most people looked at it and went, that's kind of funny looking. I don't think I care for that. As a result, well, it went away. Now, the DeSoto name did last for a while longer, but the Airflow, yeah, the Airflow these days is pretty much a footnote in history. But it is worth looking at on every level because of all the innovations associated with this particular car. As the name suggests, the Airflow was all about aerodynamics. How could it slip through the air just a little bit more efficiently? And let's start by looking at those headlights. Look how they were molded into the front of the car. Now, here at the Martin Auto Museum, we just happen to have right next to it a 1934 Chevy. And, well, not a big surprise. Back then, all of the headlights were mounted out here in between the cowl and on top of the fender, just sticking out into the air, corrupting everything. Unlike the Airflow, which made it very smooth. Then take a look at that grille, rounded, molded into the front. Yes, there is a hood ornament on top, but there's no place to put in water into your radiator. Next to it, well, a classic mid-30s style radiator, practically straight up and down. And sitting on top, well, sitting in the Airflow once again was this hood ornament, which was what you took off to put water into the radiator. Let's look at these fenders. Look at how it comes down from the cowl, it goes back up, it sticks out into the Airflow, well, pretty annoyingly if you're trying to look at it from an aerodynamic perspective. The Airflow completely different. Beginning to get these almost sensual lines coming down, blending it in so that it's smooth through the air just a little bit better. You got the spare tire mounted up on top of the fender, so it goes through the air, once again, pretty clunky, unlike the Airflow, which mounted the spare tire on the back, so it was out of the way. Spats were not uncommon back in those days, but they had a particular purpose for these because they knew that they were more aerodynamic. This car was all about going through the air efficiently, and when you compare it to a 1934 Chevrolet, boy, they just look completely different. You can see why the public said, oh yeah, we're used to that, and we're not used to that. We should pause for a moment to talk about the history of the DeSoto Car Company. It actually goes back to a company that was called DeSoto back in the early part of the 1900s. Only built cars for a few years and went out of business. In 1929, the Chrysler Company decided to resurrect that name because Hernando DeSoto was an adventurer. He's the first European who crossed the Mississippi. So it had this, adventurous kind of name going with it. What to do with the DeSoto brand? Well, they decided to kind of slot it kind of midway into the company. I mean, you got Dodge and Plymouth at the bottom, you have Chrysler and Imperial at the top, and so DeSoto was going to be that midpoint, midway through. Now, they started building cars in 1929. And I will tell you that they built some pretty amazing cars back in the 1950s. The DeSoto Adventurer Convertible, if you've never seen one of those, one of the most beautiful cars on the planet. But by then, they just decided they didn't really need a mid-range cars. They were allowing Dodge and Plymouth to build fancier cars that were kind of edging into the DeSoto range, and DeSoto wasn't enough to clip into Chrysler or Imperial. So in 1961, the DeSoto name, well, it came to an end. Now, it's not an orphan car company in the sense that these were built by Chrysler. Chrysler did not go away. The DeSoto name, similar to Pontiac, went away. And yes, we still have some of these left, but DeSoto, well, the name itself, long gone in the automotive world. So let's talk about that unibody construction that was so unique back in 1934. These days, every car does it. But in 1934, that was pretty creative. So what does it mean? Well, in 1934, and for decades to come, cars had a chassis underneath. In most cases, it was a ladder-looking thing that everything was simply built on top of it. The engine came here, the body got put here, all the pieces were built onto it. Unibody means that they take that chassis and they take the body components and they kind of mold them together. The result is that it's much stronger and much safer for the people inside. And also, it is a lighter construction because you don't have as many elements to it. So this was so far ahead of its time from that concept in terms of the way they designed it. Now, one interesting thing they did from a design perspective was they eliminated the rear trunk on the airflow. And that did not go over well. I mean, people were used to having something back here where they could stow their bags, or in the case of some cars, they actually had a rumble seat back here where somebody could sit. They decided with the Chrysler Airflow, they wanted to have it sleek back here and allow much more room in the back seat for passengers. But it turns out people really wanted their trunk, just as people wanted trunks for a long time. The interesting thing is, had they put a hatchback back here, something could lift up where you could then stow things in the back, they would have been even further ahead of their time. Because you think about it, this is really similar to the design of an SUV that we're so used to today. But in its day, this airflow, eliminating the trunk, was a bold and unfortunately not popular move. One of my favorite innovations is this window right here. I love the way you could roll down the entire window, right? Now that included the wind wing, or if all you wanted to do was open the wind wing, well, guess what? You had a second little handle right here that could do that for you. So the wind wing, when it went in, and we have to, because it's a little bit old, I have to pop it back in properly, could go in, and then you could roll the entire window down. What a creative and innovative way to handle airflow in and out of the airflow. So what was the difference between the DeSoto Airflow and the Chrysler Airflow? Because from the outside, they looked pretty much the same. They had that same aerodynamic, sleek styling. The difference, number one, with the DeSoto was that it was 11.5 inches shorter overall than the Chrysler version of the Airflow. The result caused some people to think it had kind of a stubbier look, not quite as flowing aerodynamically as the Chrysler version. The other thing, well, it was underneath the hood. In this car, you only got the 6-cylinder, 100 horsepower engine, 100 horses under the hood. The Chrysler version got the L-head 8-cylinder engine, which got a lot more horsepower. So it was a little more luxurious, had a little more power, and it was a little bit longer. That's what made the Chrysler Airflow different than this one. Because people are often afraid of something that's new, rumors began to circulate that the airflow was not safe. Despite the fact that with that unibody construction, this car was actually safer than most cars that were on the road at that point in time. And the rumors, well, it's possible some of those came from a competing car company. But having said that, they had to do something to counter that. One of the things they did, that Chrysler did with the airflow, was they actually drove one over a cliff in Pennsylvania, a 110-foot cliff, let it go all the way over, and then after it was finished rolling, they got into it and drove it away, making the point that it was safe to drive one of these cars. Now, back in those days, you didn't have social media, you didn't have viral media, you didn't have a lot of television to be able to show that off. As a result, most people didn't see it and they didn't know it. Another thing they did, trying to point to the efficiency of this car, is they did a drive from New York to San Francisco. It was sponsored and sanctioned by AAA, the Automobile Association of America. And they were able to get more than 21 miles to the gallon which was unheard of in those days. So they were doing everything they could to counter all the people's feelings that this new crazy looking car could possibly be what people wanted. And in fact, it was exactly what they needed. They just didn't realize it, or at least for another 20, 25 years. Weight distribution was another innovation for the Chrysler and DeSoto airflow. Back in the mid-1930s, the reality was people didn't pay much attention to that. In fact, most cars had the majority of their weight hanging over the rear axle. And once you began to load people into the car, it actually stressed the rear axle even more. So what the car companies did to compensate was they had a stiffer axle in the back, stiffer suspension, which made for a harsher ride, especially if there was only one person in the car at that point in time. Plus, the rear seat was over the rear axle, so that's where you got all the bouncing. What Chrysler did when they designed the airflow was they said, the engineers, let's make a 50-50 weight distribution. 50% of the weight on the rear axle, 50% of the weight on the front axle. How did they achieve that? Well, a couple ways. One thing they did was they actually moved the engine forward about 20 inches. I mean, if you look carefully, there isn't a lot of overhang on the front end of this car. They also didn't have a lot of overhang on the back of the car, and so as a result, they were able to move the seat forward just a little bit, so the passengers now were no longer riding directly over the line of the axle. So they didn't get quite as much bounce when they were going along. That 50-50 weight distribution was so creative and innovative. Today, well, guess what? Most cars have something close to it. Sports cars, all kinds of cars. If there's a particular reason why you might have something skewed one way or the other for a design purpose, they'll do it. But generally, they come pretty close to a 50-50 weight distribution just because it's more efficient and more effective. And back then, guess what? This was the only car that was doing it. While the airflow may have been the car of the future, it was definitely not the car of 1934. And the moment this hit the showroom floors, everybody pretty much knew that its days were numbered. Chrysler did everything it could to try to figure out new ways to make it more appealing to the automotive buying public, but it wasn't enough. In 1935, they came out with the Airstream, a sister car to this, not quite as well, nowhere near as advanced at this, and that's what they sold in the DeSoto dealerships. They tried making some changes to the airflow with both the Chrysler model and the DeSoto model, but it wasn't enough to get people to go, yeah, I'm really interested in buying this advanced, creative, dynamic car. It just wasn't enough to get it back into people's driveways. Now, there is one interesting footnote to this, and that's the fact that Chrysler in 2022 came out with a concept car called the Airflow. And there's talk of possibly bringing the Airflow name back into the Chrysler fold. For now, it's just a concept car, but who knows? Maybe the future will finally catch up to this 1934 Airflow.